Page. Let me start again. Our third speaker of the morning is Professor Mary Evelyn Tucker. Mary Evelyn is the co-founder and co-director, as many of you know, of the Forum on Religion and Ecology that was actually birthed here at Harvard at the Center for the Study of World Religions. She is a specialist in Japanese Neo-Confucianism, the author of Worldly Wonder, Religions Enter Their Ecological Phase, and next year she will be at the Yale Institute for Social and Public Policy. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, Mary Evelyn.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Dan Schrag, for your organizing, and Rebecca and Susan. It's truly a pleasure to be here, and thank you for so many students who are here. It's great to see such a young audience, because it's your generation that will carry this forward. I have a long paper, and I'll try and be brief and summarize some parts. We're gathered here today to consider the responses of the humanities to the immense and interconnected dimensions of our global environmental crisis. This crisis is born of the irony of unintended consequences and invites us to new forms of creativity. For with our rapid growth in the 20th century from 2 billion to over 6 billion people, we have become a planetary presence. With our collective efforts to spread modern industrialization, we have become a planetary force that is now affecting all life forms on Earth. Modernity, no doubt, has brought great benefits, including improved health and rapid communication among cultures and individuals, and certainly democracy and the Enlightenment values. Yet the unforeseen consequences of the promise of progress and the allure of modernization are now returning to haunt us. In our blind race to build a prosperous world, we have inadvertently undermined the very conditions for a sustainable future. Natural and social scientists have been documenting this undermining process for many decades with extensive research and publications. Authors of the recent Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report observe that by destroying the ecosystems on which all life depends, the foundations of civilization are being threatened. Clearly, those of us in the humanities who are concerned with the study of culture and civilization cannot ignore this challenge of sustainability, for it calls us to examine the very nature of who we are as humans and what our role is in relation to the natural world. Are we ourselves a life-threatening species or a life-supporting species? Are we emerging as a species who is losing its claim to the name Homo sapiens? Can wise humans be the ones who are threatening the survival of other life forms, changing the nature of the climate, drying up rivers and aquifers, destroying topsoil and forests at a rapid rate? If we are concerned about these questions, those of us in the humanities need to join in the conversation of the natural and social scientists regarding the environmental crisis and its global and local manifestations. We surely have something significant to contribute. For philosophers and theologians, historians and artists have reflected for centuries on this question of our nature as humans in a sustained, if contested, manner. Human interdependence with other humans and with nature has been an important focus of these discussions. Moreover, how civilizations are shaped and flourish are key concerns of many in the humanities. Indeed, these explorations have been at the heart of the humanities since the rise of the universities in the West, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, and in the centers of learning in the Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, Jewish, Islamic, and indigenous worlds as well. We need to draw on these reflections from the humanist traditions of the world's cultures and civilizations. In doing so, we are creating new grounds for a dialogue of civilizations around issues of a sustainable future, not only for humans, but for the broader Earth community as well. In this context, a sustainable future will depend on the emergence of a pluralistic, multiform, planetary civilization concerned with identifying the shape of mutually enhancing human-Earth relations. For we are all realizing, humanists and scientists alike, that the question of who we are as humans is central to the possibility of who we will become as a planetary species. In this spirit, leaders from both science and policy fields are beginning to analyze our current planetary situation and reflect on why we have not made more progress in solving environmental issues. Over the last 50 years, the enormous contributions of science to our understanding of many aspects of environmental problems, both global and local, need to be fully recognized. However, while countless scientific studies have been published and then translated into policy reports, many experts feel we have not made progress in implementing effective solutions. We are stymied by a range of obstacles, from lack of political will to ignorance to denial and inertia, and certainly to the erosion of democracy, as we've just heard. Scientists are noting that dire facts about environmental problems, as alarming as they may be, have not altered the kind of human behavior that is rapaciously exploiting nature. Nor have such facts affected human behavior habits of addictive consumption, especially in the richer and now developing nations. Moreover, policy experts are realizing that legislative or managerial regulations of nature are proving insufficient to the complex environmental challenges at hand. Environmentalists are observing that while science and policy approaches are clearly necessary, they are not sufficient in helping to transform human consciousness and behavior for a sustainable future. They are suggesting instead that values and ethics, religion and spirituality may be important factors in this transformation. This is being articulated in conferences such as this and in other publications and policy institutes. I'm going to simply summarize this section of the paper where I suggest that people like Gus Beth, the dean at the Yale School of Forestry, are weighing in on this need for values, as is E.O. Wilson here at Harvard in his book on the future of life, where he calls for the potential power of religions in their institutional and more than institutional form to weigh in. Think tanks such as World Watch Institute and the State of the World Report in 2003 had a very significant article and afterwards a paper by Gary Gardner on this, and he is writing a book on it. So policy institutes are taking this very seriously. And the 30-year anniversary of Limits to Growth that Dennis Meadows and his colleagues put together had a very powerful statement at the end, which I will simply refer to as the tools for a transition to sustainability. And he suggests that rational analysis, data systems thinking, computer modeling are what we have been using. And he says, like recycling, they are necessary and useful, but not enough. And he calls also for this values transformation. The biologist at Stanford, Paul Ehrlich, who's been speaking for many, many years on this issue, when the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment report came out last year, he suggested that what is needed is a millennium assessment of human behavior to draw the conversation in with the sciences and the social sciences. Then I will turn to the field of religion and ecology, with all its attendant difficulties. Historians and theologians of the world's religions are beginning to make significant contributions to these discussions as the field of religion and ecology is emerging. It is still in its infancy and remains to be shaped in a variety of ways and by plural perspectives. It is worth observing that the other humanities, history, literature, and philosophy, are in many respects further advanced than the religious studies in environmentally related research, publications, professional associations, and conferences. The Harvard Conference series on world religions and ecology that started here 10 years ago might be seen as a beginning of this field in terms of the world's religions, although several studies preceded that. This international conference series, involving over 800 participants and resulting in 10, one in Japanese, groundbreaking volumes, that demonstrate how perspectives and values regarding nature are shaped in frequently contested ways by various religions, cultures, and geographies. Many of the participants hope that this broadened perspective would contribute a more comprehensive and culturally diverse basis for environmental ethics, as it is conceived both within the academy and beyond. This is indeed occurring. With a growing interest in comparative environmental ethics and global ethics, these Harvard volumes are becoming useful resources for ethicists, philosophers, and theologians, as well as policymakers. Consequently, several of the Harvard books are in the process of being translated into other languages, such as Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Indonesian, and Turkish in the Islamic world. In addition, The volumes on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism are being translated into Chinese, and the Christianity volume into Spanish eventually. These books thus have the potential to connect to those interested in environmental policy in particular countries and regions around the world. For example, in two conferences that we attended in Iran, the government of Iran and the United Nations Environment Program sponsored these conferences on religion and ecology in 2001 and 2005. And the Islam volume was signaled for attention by the Minister of the Environment, who is encouraging its translation into Farsi. Similarly, 2 years ago, the Chinese Deputy Minister for the Environment, Pan Yue, made a lengthy speech calling for the development of environmental ethics in China based on the traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. In addition, the Hinduism and Ecology volume has been published in India, where there are numerous projects already underway, such as tree planting and river restoration, based on Hindu and Jain values. There is still much to be done within the academy, for the newly emerging field of world religions and ecology has yet to be more robustly shaped and defined. As the field unfolds, the role of scholars will also be developing, documenting this newly emerging alliance, identifying the resources for its further emergence, and providing critical analysis. Throughout this process, scholars in the field will be striving to raise thoughtful questions and pioneer self-reflexive methodologies. There are varied roles here for engaged intellectuals, constructive theologians, and historically and textually based scholars. In addition, the challenge is to create bridges between other scholars interested in the environment from the perspective of the humanities and from the social, natural, and even the applied sciences, such as medicine and public health. This is why we organized two major interdisciplinary conferences in New York at the United Nations and the American Museum of Natural History in October of '98, attended by over 1,000 people. In addition, we held interdisciplinary conferences on world religions and animals, and that book will be published this fall by Columbia Press. Nature Writers and the Ecological Imagination, thanks to help from Larry Buell. A Religions and Climate Change with a Daedalus volume, and 4 week-long seminars on cosmology and religion. In this context, religions and scholars of religions can be seen then as necessary, although not sufficient, partners, for they need to be in dialogue with scientists, economists, and policymakers. And that is also why we created the Harvard website with these dialogue partners. In addition, there are broad movements such as deep ecology, ecofeminism, and environmental justice beyond institutional religions that are helping to shape the discussion of values for a viable future. The key is to create a tent large enough for all these to coexist and to contribute. The Harvard Conference Series on Religion and Ecology was based on an acknowledgement of the dark side of religion that Don referred to, as well as to the recognition of the disjunction of religious traditions and modern environmental problems. The participants acknowledged the historical and cultural divide between texts written in earlier periods for different ends. They worked within a process of retrieval of texts and traditions, critical reevaluation, and reconstruction for present circumstances. They underscored the gap between theory and practice, noting that textual passages celebrating nature do not automatically lead to the protection of nature. There is thus an important dialogue that should occur between environmental historians and historians of religion to explore the interaction of intellectual ideas and practices in relation to actual environmental conditions. Despite these caveats, there is growing recognition that religious and cultural traditions have helped to shape worldviews and ethics regarding nature and our place in it. These traditions, moreover, are far from static entities, but rather are dynamic, contested processes, adapting with different times and circumstances. Indeed, our study in the humanities are dedicated to exploring how religious and cultural traditions are constantly negotiating the boundaries of change and continuity and of ideas and action. As a historian of religion, especially East Asian religions, I am interested in understanding what these traditions have said in their own cultural and historical contexts, as well as what they say in our times. I acknowledge the concerns of those who argue for the incommensurate nature of cultural differences that are involved in studying other religions. This is why we rely on the rigorous scholarly work of historians and theologians. At the same time, I observe with many others that these traditions have significant ideas regarding who we are as humans and our relationship to nature, which transcend the particularity of culture or historical contexts. It is in this spirit of acknowledging differences of time and circumstances and yet valuing the efficacy of ideas transcending such particularity that I turn now to my own field of Confucian studies to explore a leading figure in the Neo-Confucian tradition of China, Wang Yangming, not a household word, but a 15th century scholar, statesman, and soldier. In a book titled Key Environmental Thinkers, published in 2001, there are only 6 persons included who are not Western thinkers: Buddha, Gandhi, and Vandana Shiva from India, Chuangzi and Wang Yangming from China, and Basho from Japan. I cannot help but wonder what this book will look like 50 years from now as we begin to discover individuals beyond the West who will expand our environmental thinking from out of the humanistic legacy of world cultures that we are inheriting in all their rich diversity. Wang Yangming is one of these individuals. Along with Zhu Xi, Wang was the most influential thinker in the Chinese Neo-Confucian tradition. His ideas spread across East Asia and endured in both Korea and Japan for some 500 years. In Japan, Confucians interested in implementing humane government relied on his teachings, as did the reformers in the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century. Seen as controversial by some more orthodox Confucians, he nonetheless has made important contributions to humanistic thought and praxis that warrant our consideration today. The 3 pillars of his thought are an emphasis on empathetic knowing, embodied action, and compassionate being in the world. Empathetic knowing, I would suggest, is affirming human subjectivity as a primary way of apprehending the nature of things. Embodied acting, he would suggest, is unifying knowledge and action for effective work in the world. And compassionate living is, according to Wang, embracing a common kinship with the larger community of life. These ideas then include both humanistic and ecological values and can be more fully appreciated as situated within the broader context of the Confucian and Neo-Confucian tradition itself. Now, what I want to do here, and I'll do it maybe in a foreshortened way, is when I'm referring to the Confucian tradition, it's the early classical tradition of Confucius and Mencius, 500 years before the Common Era, and then the Han period of correspondences of microcosm relations of the same time as the Roman Empire, about 200 before the Common Era, 200 after the Common Era. And then we burst into what's often called a Renaissance of thought in China with the Sung period, and the Sung, Yuan, and Ming, the Neo-Confucian revival and synthesis that draws in a whole range of earlier thinking. Now, these values had such appeal of the Confucian and Neo-Confucian tradition that they swept across East Asia, had a major impact in Korea and Japan, and also in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, and now in the small countries of Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong. And certainly with Tu Weiming's work here at Harvard and my colleague John Berthrong, this revival of Confucianism in the contemporary period, the new Confucian philosophers in Hong Kong and Taiwan have been much better understood. Now, although this tradition is not well known in the West, the humanistic and ecological perspectives of Confucian and Neo-Confucian thinkers merit our attention. For these are individuals who have dealt for 2.5 millennia with pressing questions of how to create sustainable societies supported by a politics that promotes the common good. Within this ancient Confucian ideal of establishing humane government, they encouraged the equitable distribution of goods and provided the conditions for agriculture and commerce to flourish. Against formidable odds and despite frequent failures, they struggled with how to sustain effective political and social institutions. To staff these institutions, they created the oldest meritocracy in the world, in which government appointments were based on civil service examinations that drew on the values of the Confucian classics. All leaders, even the emperor himself, were called to the task of ongoing moral cultivation. In this spirit, Confucian education was a means of encouraging self-cultivation of the literati, the scholar officials, so that they could contribute to the well-being of the larger society and the body politic. Thus, Confucians promoted education, fostered printing, created immense libraries, established academies, and built universities. They also encouraged the arts, celebrated nature in painting and poetry, kept detailed historical records, and wrote lasting interpretive histories. While Confucianism, like all religious and philosophical traditions, at times became distant from its ideals and used for autocratic ends, it nonetheless was a dynamic and unifying force for one of the world's oldest continuing civilizations. Its promotion of broad humanistic education in the family and in schools is one of the reasons for its continuity into the present. The aim of such education and self-cultivation was to realize one's innate good nature and ultimately to achieve sagehood. This is what Wang Yongming prized above all, beyond fame, position, or power. Such cultivation of the person was based on a firm belief in the goodness of human nature, as well as an understanding of the inherent unity of thinking and feeling. Indeed, the Chinese character for mind implies both functions, and it is often translated as heart-mind or mind and heart. We spent many hours at Columbia trying to decide how to translate this. And in Japan, often people would say, I've been thinking about this. This is a unified heart-mind, what Weiming also calls feeling thinking. The human, in the Confucian context, then, is considered to be the heart-mind of heaven and earth, meaning the thinking, feeling organ of the whole universe. And I will return to this. Another distinguishing feature of Confucianism is its recognition that the basis of a sustainable society and civilization is a healthy agricultural system. Confucian governments built complex irrigation works as well as regional granaries for the storage of rice. Moreover, in the capital city, the emperor supported the development of farming almanacs and calendars. He performed rituals at the altar of earth for the planting and harvesting of rice. All of this was done with detailed attention to seasonal changes and the appropriate cultivation of nature. Even Wes Jackson would appreciate this, I think. In East Asia, then, cultivating nature was a primary concern of Confucians. This cultivation embraced both the natural and the human worlds, namely agricultural cultivation of the land for producing food and moral cultivation of the human for creating virtue. In essence, these were seen as mutually related activities, for the human was not viewed as an isolated entity, but as part of the larger community of life, social, natural, cosmological. Tu Weiming has called this an anthropocosmic worldview, the human and the cosmos, micro-macrocosm, in contrast to the more human-centered or anthropocentric emphasis of the Western religions and philosophical traditions. This anthropocosmic worldview is distinguished by a naturalistic cosmology and transformative ethics. Again, I will summarize this part of the paper. And what I'm suggesting here is this naturalistic cosmology is based on the idea of organic holism, where there's not a notion of a creator God or an origin of things, but a self-generating, ongoing universe, a great chain of being that is in continuity, what Tu Weiming calls a continuity of being, embracing all the forms of life from mineral, plants, animals, to humans. And this is unified by the notion of qi, or ki in the Japanese context, this idea of a psycho-spiritual, vital force, translated in many different ways, material force of the universe. And this qi is something that humans share with the plant, animal, natural world, and the cosmos itself. And that is part of this basis of reciprocity that I will turn to shortly with Wang Yongming. This notion of qi as a material force, the substance of life, and as the basis for the continuing flux and fecundity in the universe. And the term used often by the Neo-Confucianism is life, these two Chinese characters, production, reproduction. And the notion here is that these great cosmic forces of transformation were something that the human was supposed to harmonize with, to organize societies around, and to cultivate one's inner life. In fact, the text suggests that humans are to model themselves on the ceaseless vitality of cosmic processes, the ceaseless vitality. I would suggest this is very different from a Buddhist understanding of change as a source of suffering. This is a valuation of change and the beauty of the natural world as bringing joy, renewal, and vitality. And that's part of the cultivation for a larger common good, not only for one's own personal ends. This creative transformation that the Confucian tradition invites us into also suggested that humans are part of a large triad, which is heaven, earth, and humans, without a radical transcendence. And heaven would be like a presence, a guiding moral force, and earth is the natural world. But this triad is what humans are born into, and yet it's also the call to achieve that realization of forming a triad. In other words, to achieve how we as humans complete the universe and realize this notion that we are the mind and heart of heaven and earth. In doing this, what I'm suggesting here is this is how humans touch the depth of things. They enter into relationality in profound ways with other humans, but with the whole natural world. They enter the depth of things. And in cultivating their moral nature within this triad, humans are entering these cosmological processes of change as well. And numerous images from nature are used to describe moral self-cultivation, such as planting and nourishing seeds, pulling up weeds, not overgrazing land, or cutting down trees wantonly. Human beings nurture the seeds of virtue within themselves and participate in both the natural and human orders of renewal. This is elaborated by the Neo-Confucians through a specific understanding as correspondences between virtues practiced by humans as having their natural counterpart in cosmic processes. Through self-cultivation, then, humans affect the growth and transformation of things. This is the language from the doctrine of the mean. And create the possibility for a flourishing, sustainable society. This metaphor of humans completing the triad originates in classical Confucianism, but it finds one of its richest expressions in Chang Sai, a Sung dynasty Neo-Confucian who used this parental notion of filiality and loyalty to the whole cosmos. And these are just a few lines from one of his most famous sayings, the Western inscription, which he had on the wall of his study as a daily reminder of this relationship. Heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and even such a small child as I find an intimate place in their midst. Therefore, that which fills the universe, this great vast chi, that which fills the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. And that includes the whole sentient world. Let me move to Wang Yangming to just lift up a few of his ideas in this context then. This 15th century Neo-Confucian scholar, statesman, and military leader was born into a period of enormous upheaval. Wang struggled to overcome great personal difficulties to formulate a system of thought and action that challenged the orthodox Neo-Confucianism of his day. Against formidable odds of political corruption, social decay, and educational mediocrity, none of which we know about, he offered fresh and invigorating perspectives on perennial Confucian problems. There are three aspects of his thought which are particularly conducive, that I've mentioned, to the formulation of an ecological philosophy and ethics. These are his ideas of innate good knowing, the unity of knowledge and action, and forming one body with all things. The first involves an empathy of knowing. The second implies an embodied action, and the third suggests a kinship of being. Through these ideas, Wang articulates a profound sense of reciprocity with all of life, touching the depth of things. Moreover, he understands the human as having a heart-mind that embraces the interconnected circles of society, nature, and cosmos. Now, very briefly, let me suggest just a little bit more about this empathy of knowing. His emphasis on innate knowledge of the good was the central focus of his thought. And in highlighting this empathy of knowing, Wang was attempting to overcome the fragmentation of learning and the objectification of knowledge that characterized what he felt were the degenerate forms of Confucianism in his time. And he wished to express his experience of an integrated heart-mind. This is something he describes as having a mirror-like quality, and that the mind has a capacity, this is my term, for sympathetic resonance. But he says, he notes that the mind's original substance is sincerity and commiseration, which can be extended outward. So the whole point here is how to activate these innate characteristics of sympathy, empathy, commiseration, and extend it outward. Wang felt that this empathetic basis of apprehension needed to be recovered before things could be properly investigated. And so he emphasizes sincerity of the will. And this is a long discussion of his disagreements with Jushi on that. This intuitive knowledge is where cognitive, affective, and ethical intelligence of the heart-mind is experienced as one. Let me turn then to the unity of knowledge and action. For Wang, this cultivation of an empathetic knowing led to the unity of knowledge and action. For when innate knowledge arises into consciousness, then spontaneous and appropriate action is possible. Now, these are contested things within the tradition, but throughout his life of intense commitments as scholar, statesman, and soldier, Wang demonstrated this fundamental unity of knowing and doing. And for him, these are two parts of one spontaneous movement. He suggests, these are his words, knowledge and action are two words describing the same one effort. He says, action is knowledge in its genuine and concrete aspects. Knowledge is action in its intelligent, conscious, and discerning aspects. Wang thus aimed to promote embodied action in the world that followed naturally from one's deep inner springs of innate wisdom. The goal was to encourage spontaneity that brought one into vibrant relationship with other humans and with all forms of life. And I'll conclude with this third major contribution, that formation, realization of the joining the triad of heaven and earth, joining with the cosmic processes, unifying with the natural processes. Thus, from innate knowing and the unity of knowledge and action spring Wang's rich understanding of forming one body with all things. This microcosmic, macrocosmic identity characterizes Wang's thought and draws on many earlier strands of Confucian thought while broadening it and deepening it. This resonant language for expressing this identity embraces not only the human order, but the natural order as well. What makes his thought distinctive is the expression of sympathy and concern from humans to animals and plants and all living things, and finally, even to inanimate objects. The ecological implications are manifold in the final selections from his writings, and I will conclude here with Wang's words. That the great person can regard heaven and earth and the myriad things as one body is not because he deliberately wants to do so, but because it is natural to the humane nature of his mind that he do so. Therefore, when he sees a child about to fall into a well, he cannot help a feeling of alarm and commiseration. This shows that his humanity forms one body with the child. It may be objected that the child belongs to the same species. Again, when he observes the pitiful cries and frightened appearance of birds and animals about to be slaughtered, he cannot help feeling an inability to bear their suffering. This shows that his humanity forms one body with birds and animals. It may be objected that birds and animals are sentient beings, as he is. But when he sees plants broken and destroyed, he cannot help but feel a sense of pity. This shows that his humanity forms one body with plants. It may be said that plants are living things as he is. Yet even when he sees tiles and stones shattered and crushed, he cannot help a feeling of regret. This shows that his humanity forms one body with tiles and stones. Such a mind is rooted in his heaven-endowed nature and is naturally intelligent, clear, and not beclouded. Surely Wang Yangming touched the depth of things. May we also do so.
We started a little late, so let's take just a very few minutes for a couple of questions.
I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on the difference in the attitude of change between Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism.
Well, one way to look at it would be Thomas Berry used to say India invented the idea of nothingness, but China painted it. China has an immense feeling, and no doubt in part, I should have mentioned, to the Taoist tradition, which it interacts with in great measure throughout history. But the Chinese do have, in contrast to the South Asian traditions, a very strong affirmation of the natural world. And therefore, withdrawing, certainly for enlightenment and engagement, is important. But the references, the huge literature on nature, the poetry and the painting, would simply confirm once again that we are humans in our fullest form in relationship to the natural world. The Buddhist tradition, I would certainly not want to disavow this or make this, such a strong black and white contrast. But especially in its earlier form, it is concentrating on enlightenment for the individual, the arhat, the monk, and so on, a monastic tradition. And in its Chinese form, it's when it became painted. That's when the unity of Taoism and Buddhism created Chan. And then you have the creation of the Zen gardens and these magnificent arts that the East Asian world has contributed through Buddhism and its syncretism with Taoism and Confucianism. Yes?
I'm so happy to hear what you're saying about Qi, and I think it's so important. I wanted to raise the question this way. The Dalai Lama said nature is not sacred because there's suffering and life and death and change. Do you think that you can connect this sense of Qi and empathetic knowing and so forth with the sense of the sacredness as we understand it in the West of natural theology? And if so, how do we deal with the question of suffering?
I was missing a little what you're saying. Can I connect the sacredness of nature?
Yeah. In the West, we talk about natural theology, that you can perceive the divine in nature, but although they see it as secondary to the Bible. But the problem of suffering in nature, not just from human intent, but like storms, limits the sense of the sacredness in nature. So if we're to cultivate the sense of empathy and harmony with nature, which is so important and absolutely essential, what do we do with that? What do we do with the suffering and distinguishing between the eternal, unchanging, and the changing world?
Yeah. Well, this is a complex problem, and although I would just suggest that perhaps, in the Western traditions, I'll speak from the Christian tradition, the notion was there are two books. There are more than one book of Revelation, and the book of nature is also a book of Revelation. So you have the written scripture, you have the scripture from nature, you have the scripture from history, and you have the scripture from the human heart. And that is part of the Western traditions as well. But this notion that you're pointing to is extremely important, that I think still have to be worked out in Western traditions and in Asian traditions, namely tsunamis namely the great upheavals that nature is part of. And the Confucian tradition was deeply aware of disharmony. Confucius himself was born into a time of tremendous disharmony. And this is why even in the present regime, you get this resistance to upheaval. And that was of a social and a natural kind. They've had to feed probably more people than any other civilization over time. And so they were trying continually to manage nature in certain ways, waterworks. And so this sense of reverence for nature comes with a huge awareness of these complex cosmological processes that also cause disruption. So order and disorder are part of the yin-yang of this world view.
One more question, and then I think
I was wondering, first of all, of course, I'm very grateful. This is a magnificent, very magnificent vision of things. Recently, I've been talking to Shanta Premavarna at the National Council of Churches and Bud Heckman at Religions for Peace USA, who have been meeting with the business community on ways to advance this kind of concern about the environment, about peace, about interreligious cooperation. They're having a hard time getting the energy going, but I think that you also, with the unusual amount of travel that you do and the speaking that you do, can you point to anything aside from the religious institutions in Western or industrialized cultures around the world that would tend to push in the direction of some kind of movement in the direction that the Chinese philosophy that you've just outlined would take us? In other words, are there seeds of enlightened self-interest that we could point to as we try to promote this agenda?
Yes, thank you, Francis. Well, it's a huge question, but I think Don referred to some of this in various countries that are modeling it. But I would also suggest that the EU, which has as part of its mission statement sustainability, and the conferences that I've been to in Europe are just, well, imperfect, far more enlightened in terms of a leadership role in the world on this. Gorbachev has held 2 conferences in Europe on Earth Dialogues, Is Ethics the Missing Link? Ministers of the environment come, ministers from the EU, and NGOs come to discuss this sensibility. And then I would also suggest that the Earth Charter, I think, has been a very hopeful, much negotiated document that arose out of the Rio 92 summit, and Gorbachev and Maurice Strong suggested that a new ethics was needed to guide sustainability. And from 97 to 2000, I was part of an international drafting committee which incorporated an evolutionary worldview and a sense of the myriad forms of life as what one is responsible for in the preamble. And then the 3 parts of the Earth Charter are ecological integrity. If it all goes down, it's a primacy of ecological integrity, social economic justice, and democracy, nonviolence, and peace. And we've just celebrated the 5th anniversary of that in the Netherlands. The Prime Minister of the Netherlands gave one of the most rousing talks for this sense of a responsibility for equity issues, democracy issues, and environmental responsibility around the globe. So I think there's a lot of hope if we could just see it beyond the blur of our news reporting. Thank you very much.